evening. We can do a little bit better than that. You know me, I like high energy, but I need that interaction. So good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you. I am Sheila Boston, president of the New York City Bar Association, AKA the Bar of Hope. That is for 2 more weeks. To the day, nonetheless. Time has flown by. 2 years already gone, just like that, and I can't believe it. But I am your pandemic president, and so elated to be here in person in the meeting hall of the House of the Association. And of course, I am delighted to welcome you, each and every one, to the Debevoise Plimpton Barbara Paul Robinson series. Now, Barbara Paul Robinson, I see you, second row in the middle. I see you, and it's wonderful to see you. We are blessed by your presence. And I have just one question for you, and it's a matter of physics. Are you ready? Maybe. Okay, she shrugged her shoulders in case you didn't see her. I see you sitting over there. How are you over there when I'm over here standing on your shoulders? I just want to know. Seriously. We want to thank you for your trailblazing path, and it's not just I, but others who stand on your shoulders. So thank you for all you've done. Can we give her a round of applause, please? Barbara's becoming the first woman president of this association in 1994, after having been the first woman at Debevoise, was a watershed moment for diversity, equity, and inclusion, a topic about which many of you know I am very passionate. And it has been one of the 6 pillars of my presidency. Now, there's something else about Barbara you may or may not know. She is a player, not only in the legal field, but in the actual field. What are you talking about, Sheila? For those of you who don't know, I'm referring to gardening. Gardener. She is excellent at it. And by the way, Barbara, I still want to take you up on that offer to come and see your beautiful garden one day. Okay, great, thank you. Essentially, Barbara Paul Robinson is a cultivator extraordinaire, whether it's flowers and vegetables or people and careers. Ergo, what leads us to this evening, the Barbara Paul Robinson series. The City Bar was blessed upon Barbara's retirement to add the Debevoise Plimpton Barbara Paul Robinson series to its roster of awards and special programs. It is especially a curation of life stories, career stories of remarkable people and how they achieved so much of their potential, the purpose of which is to inspire others to do the same. The first event was a wonderful conversation with Justices Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Sonia Sotomayor. That was followed by a fascinating fireside chat between Kenneth Frazier, chairman and CEO of Merck, and Conrad Harper, the first Black president of this association, and another person upon whose shoulder I stand. And I did see him earlier. Where is he? Right here. Can we give him a round of applause as well? Conrad Harper. And now, for the third program in this series, we are fortunate to be able to bring together Bob Fiske, Jim Johnson, and Mary Jo White, about whom you will hear shortly from our moderator, the brilliant John Kiernan, another of my esteemed predecessors as president of this association, and himself the author of a remarkable career. I, for one, just cannot wait to hear from all of our guests about the winding roads, the starts and the stops, the ceaseless efforts, the sliding doors, the calculated risks, the serendipitous detours, the chance encounters, and the interconnections of which notable careers are made. In fact, I'm so excited when I'm done, I'm gonna go sit in the front row and listen intently. So without further ado, I want to go ahead and now pass the mic over to my friend, John Kiernan. And John, get us started. The floor is now all yours, sir. Thank you.
So thanks very much, Sheila, and welcome to all of you. It's great to see you all, and let me join Sheila in thanking and Barbara Robinson, who is the original prime mover, the thinker, and the animating force behind this series, and so many other good things about the city bar and the practice of law. Tonight, we get to spend an hour or so in the company of three lawyers whose careers pretty much epitomize the concept of a fully realized legal career. They share in common records of extraordinary success and performance as both public servants and private practitioners, and deserved reputations for the kinds of integrity, selflessness, personal drive, determination to serve, and commitment to the truth that other lawyers can only dream of achieving. I'm going to avoid engaging us all in the fun parlor game of how do you possibly abridge the bios of these remarkable people, and just give you a quick summary that isn't almost necessary because you all know their accomplishments so well. Bob Fiske, as you undoubtedly know, is senior counsel at Davis Polk, where he has been since 1955, with interruptions to serve as an assistant U.S. attorney in the Southern District from 1957 to 61, then as U.S. attorney from 1976 to 80, and as independent counsel for the Whitewater investigation in 1994. I think it's not an exaggeration to say that most of us in this room literally can't remember a time when Bob wasn't recognized as one of the most effective, insightful, honest, and accomplished lawyers in the history of New York State. And I guess since I was 1 year old when he arrived at Davis Polk in 1955, I fall into that category. Mary Jo White is currently senior chair of Debevoise Plimpton, where she has most notably set and repeatedly broken to the point of untouchability the record for most times departed from the firm and then returned to it. She postponed her post-graduation first trip to Debevoise to clerk for Judge Marvin Frankel from 1975 to 1976. She worked she then joined Debevoise and left to become an AUSA in the Southern District from 1978 to 81. Came back to Debevoise, starred for a while longer, then left for a succession of roles, beginning with first assistant U.S. attorney in the Eastern District in 1990, acting U.S. attorney in the Eastern District in 1992, and United States attorney for the Southern District of New York from 1993 to 2002. She joined us, but she couldn't stay. She had to leave again to become chair of the SEC from 2013 to 2017. Both in those public sector jobs and in her private work at Debevoise, Mary Jo has built a deserved reputation for indefatigability, character, strength as a lawyer, fierceness of judgment that makes her appropriately one of the very, very few most called upon lawyers in America by people who need the very best lawyer that can be found. Jim Johnson has similarly been a leader both in private practice, where he worked for about 20 total years, most of them at Debevoise as first as an associate and then later as a partner, but a few years at Morrison Forrester, also as a partner, and in a broad range of important and fascinating public service. He, too, was an assistant U.S. attorney, where he ended up as deputy chief of the criminal division. But then he left the office to become first assistant secretary and then ultimately undersecretary of the Treasury for enforcement, a job with a tremendous remit, including oversight responsibilities for customs, ATF, Secret Service, and other enforcement functions. Jim came back from that service and served many years as a partner at Debevoise, and then left in 2017 to run for governor of New Jersey. He didn't win, but it's a telling character indication of the kind of character and presence and credibility he had, that the person who did win, Governor Murphy, asked Jim to be his special advisor, which is not something that victors necessarily do to their opponents. And it says a little something about what kind of overall credibility Jim had. He did that while also
He
serving.
did pay me $1 a year, though.
Oh, there you go. We knew there was something in it for you, Jim. Right, yeah.
Well, I was going to say Jim Wells was filling lonely hours as a senior fellow at the Brennan Center, which he had previously chaired for 7 years at that time. But then, in order to occupy himself a little more fully, in 2019 he became Corporation Counsel for the City of New York City's lawyer, and most recently he is Chief Operating Officer for Trinity Church Wall Street, a remarkable institution whose tendrils reach deeply into all kinds of areas of policy and public good in New York City, including predominantly or largely homelessness, housing, criminal justice reform, other advocacy issues, while also doing things like managing a divinity school and a retreat center. So it's a remarkable collection of jobs, and in all of the jobs, they've all been characterized, and Jim's performance in them has been characterized by a broad recognition that he has this particular human skills in the resolution of very difficult disputes, of being able to see how to get to the center, about being able to hear both sides and listen to them effectively, bridge barriers and get consensus when it needs to get done, but also make the very tough judgments that have to be made when adversaries are taking positions that are unacceptable. So it would be fun to keep talking for a long time more about the tremendous accomplishments of these folks, but let's hear from them instead. So let me start with a variant on the question that Judge Weinfeld apparently always asked his law clerks as his first question. Who are you, where do you come from, and how did you get from where you were to where you are now? And Bob, you want to take a first crack at that?
Sure. Well, I graduated from Yale in 1952. I went to Michigan Law School and graduated in 1955. And probably the most important event in my life at that time was in my second year at Michigan Law School, the summer of 1954. Two very important things happened that summer. First and most important, I married my wife, Janet, celebrating our 68th wedding anniversary in August of this year. The other thing was my dad had a good friend who happened to be the U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York, the first U.S. Attorney in the Eisenhower administration, a man named J. Edward Lombard, went on to be Chief Judge of the Second Circuit. He had just started as U.S. Attorney, and he came to our house for Thanksgiving dinner in the fall of my second year at Michigan. And in the course of the dinner, he said, Bob, what are you going to do next summer? And I said, actually, Judge, I really hadn't thought about that yet. I'll figure that out during the spring, which is what people thought in those days. Practically nobody worked in law offices in the summer. But he said, I'm starting this program in the U.S. Attorney's Office where I'm going to have students come in and you work one-on-one with an assistant U.S. attorney. We can't pay you anything, but it'll be a great experience. So I signed up, and it was a turning point in my career. I had the great fortune to work with Fred Nathan, who many of you know, a wonderful man. And we tried a case together. I actually did almost everything except participate in the trial. And it was an extraordinary experience. And it sort of infused in me the importance of public service, which was a very important part of Judge Lombard's credo. So I went back to him at the end of the summer and said, I'd love to come back here as soon as I can. He said, that's a great idea, but you should go first to a law firm and get some experience for a couple of years, get some training. So I went to Debevoise Polk, where I've been my entire career except for public service. And that was really the springboard for my career, which has combined public service with private practice, as John described. And I'm a firm believer in the fact that people that do both private practice and public service are better lawyers They're better lawyers at each one of those because they've done both. Because people in government service that have had the experience in private practice, first of all, know more about the industries that they're supposed to be investigating or regulating. And secondly, they have a more balanced background against which to make the important judgment decisions they have to make. And conversely, people who've been in government service, who go, because of the enormously increased responsibility you get in government service, become much better lawyers in private practice because of that. So because of that experience in the summer, that really was a springboard for the career that John has described. And so I think maybe I'll stop talking and let someone else.
Okay, thanks, Bob. Mary Jo?
It's going to be like, this is a recording a little bit. I think Debevoise has sort of served in my career, Bob, as Davis Polk has for you, and the U.S. Attorney's Office similarly, and the call to public service is just, once the bug bites you, I think that never leaves you. I've also loved private practice. Where do I come from? You know, a little further back than that. I was actually born in Kansas City, Missouri. And I say Missouri, right, so you actually know I'm from there. And my father was a government lawyer, different kind. He was worked for the then called the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. He got a promotion when I was 10 years old, 5th grade, moved to McLean, Virginia. Public schools, I was about 2 grades behind, which you can draw whatever inference from that or not. I got caught up, went to college at William & Mary, and then married my husband of 52 years, so I've got a ways to go to catch up with Bob, whom I met in high school. And then we both went to law school, he to NYU, I to Columbia. We thought it was better for the marriage to be in 2 different law schools. That's sort of worked out, I think, for both of us. And then, you know, I've really been at Debevoise or either in the U.S. Attorney's Office, Southern District of New York or Eastern District of New York, or my most recent, you know, bout of restlessness was to go to Washington, D.C., its own experience, we'll come back to that, as the chair of the Securities and Exchange Commission. So I feel like I've been very, very fortunate in my career, and I could not, by the way, agree more with what Bob said about, you know, what's pejoratively referred to as the revolving door, I guess, and that's a shame because I think it does a disservice to both the lawyers who do it and also the benefits that it really reaps for the public to have lawyers serve in the private sector, public sector. I definitely agree that you're better at both when you do that, and I think you're better at serving the public when you do that. You know, you worry today about really driving people away from public service. You know, really good people, they either don't get nominated because of the controversy that they once represented a bank or something, or they don't, who wants to put up with kind of the abuse that, you know, you kind of get for the various things you do in the private sector. It's sort of part of that, you know, I think very destructive in many ways, you know, partisanship in Washington now. But, you know, it's been a tremendous career for me. I can't, you know, say how fortunate I've been, and obviously I'm still doing it 24/7, so glad to be here tonight, too.
Thanks, Mary Jo. Jim?
Sitting between Bob Fiske and Mary Jo White and being asked the question, who are you and how'd you get here, feels hostile. And my path is a little bit different. So just by way of background, I grew up in Montclair, New Jersey. In my family, both my parents had lots of kids, had lots of siblings. I grew up in a cohort of 55 cousins.
Wow.
And within that cohort, there were a handful of us that were raised in one zip code or went to school in one zip code. And the rest were raised in very different zip codes. And the opportunities afforded them compared to the opportunities that I had were different. And our outcomes have been, as a result of that, in many respects, very, very different. And so I was born in 1960 and grew up in the wake of the activity of the Civil Rights Movement, and the drive for justice was a big part of my family's life, and the appreciation of the law. My mother was a secretary in a law firm, where some people would put baseball cards on the refrigerator and things like that, and artwork from the children. She put clippings from the Amsterdam News of various legal stars who were African American or otherwise leaders who were African American. And so to sit here, sitting in front of Thurgood Marshall, who was, anytime he was in the paper, he was on the refrigerator, it's who are you and how did you get here? But it was part of what shaped me. And so my parents made a point of exposing me to lawyers in a variety of positions. When I was in 7th grade, I had half the summer I spent being a bagger in the supermarket, and the other part I was just an observer in a municipal judge's courtroom in Newark, New Jersey, because they wanted me to see. And I grew up with my parents routinely saying, watch this person. See what they have done. Take your lessons there, and you can really achieve anything. And I took that to heart. Both parents worked 7 days a week. I went to, my brother, sister, and I all attended a private school in Montclair, and then I went on to Harvard College, and then Harvard Law School. And at Harvard Law School, following on my parents' example idea of pay attention to who is doing something that you might want to do and learn a lesson of what's possible. So at Harvard Law School, second year, the tradition then was to get a summer job at a law firm for sure. I ended up sitting in a ridiculously small hotel room across from Mary Jo White. And
That doesn't, it's not what it sounds like, actually.
we were sitting.
That's where we interviewed in those days.
That's where we interviewed in those days. Yeah. And the, I'm so careful I wouldn't even go there.
Well, I'm just listening here. But.
Right. And then, but what happened was, at the time there were very, very few people that looked anything like me in large law firms. And we were not separated at birth, obviously, but Mary Jo gave me a sense of what's possible no matter what. And that was a significant liftoff point for me to decide, something, maybe I can go to this large firm and do well there. And I ended up in the U.S. Attorney's Office, being promoted to Deputy Chief by Mary Jo White. And when I went down to Washington, among the things they did to kick the tires was to talk to Mary Jo. And I went down to Washington actually twice. Once was to work on the White House security review because a plane had crashed in the front lawn, south lawn, and the gunman had shot up the front lawn. And so if you want to blame somebody for closing Pennsylvania Avenue, blame Mary Jo because she sent me. And through various iterations, I end up here in front of Thurgood Marshall, feeling very much like an imposter.
And we're willing to pay him almost as much as Governor Murphy paid him for that stint. Let me follow up on a comment that a few of you made about two of the challenges of moving from private sector work to public sector work are first the revolving door. Well, first the general point that if you are providing public service in matters of great importance and great sensitivity, the prospect of personal attacks on you is a very high one, and that carries its costs. And the second, and how do you think your way through that and muddle through serving effectively? And second, the revolving door, and I'll just use as a sort of a tossing off point. In February 2013, there was a brief debate in the New York Times where Andrew Ross Sorkin wrote in a Deal Book column a squib raising the question whether Mary Jo White could be effective in having just been nominated as chair of the SEC in enforcement against big institutions, given that she'd spent the last bunch of years of her life defending them, which prompted a almost instantaneous letter to the editor of the Times, initially signed by a large number of prosecutors and leading litigators, but as published, showing only 2 signatures, former U.S. attorneys John Martin and Bob Fiske, saying, in essence, we know Mary Jo White, and we don't think any reasonable human being on earth could question, based on her record as our iconic U.S. attorney, whether she is sufficiently vigorous in enforcement of the law against major corporations. But there is that component of this movement from public to private that involves changes of sensibilities. And can you comment on that?
Yeah, maybe I'll start it off. I guess I said some of it. First of all, thank you, Bob, for that, and I owe you so many other thank yous. And Bob also hired me, by the way, as a young assistant U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York, which sort of set me on the course we've sort of been talking about. I mean, look, again, Bob said it very well. I mean, I think there's no doubt in my mind if you're an ethical, principled person, you can serve very well in the private sector and the public sector. And even more importantly, in some ways, you really do better service in both places if you've been in both sectors. So, for example, when I became U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York in 1993, I had a fairly substantial white-collar defense background representing companies. And so I don't know if I was called Attila the Hun by corporate America when I was U.S. Attorney, but I really knew a lot more about how to, I hope appropriately but aggressively, prosecute and know what it means when something is asserted to you as a defense. And then I think when you serve in the government, we'll say SEC for an example, but you learn how government types think about things. You also learn what's expected of you in the private sector. So when you come out of the government experience, I think you're able to advise your clients better, yes, for their sake, but also I think in a way that is good for the public because they are much more likely to follow that advice, which is better informed, to comply with the law and not just the letter, but the spirit of the law. So, and again, I sort of, come back to, and it's gotten worse, I think, John, in terms of, the criticisms that you get for serving in both those sectors. The other point you made is also important, which is how do you, particularly as a public servant, but this is true in the private sector, how do you kind of deal with the criticisms that you get or accusations that you get that either you haven't been fair, you haven't been aggressive, or you ought to do this instead of whatever you're doing. And look, that's just part of it. Part of the wonderful thing about being in the U.S. Attorney's Office, for example, is your job is to do the right thing in the right way and not to be persuaded, influenced by criticism or even, public frenzy, media frenzy, and you just learn to do that. I think one of the things that I think I was very fortunate in is, my upbringing in some way. Somebody asked me this, how do you stand up to that criticism and kind of go on and make the choice you think is right or the right thing to do, as opposed to the popular thing to do. And I said, you're just sort of brought up in a way to do the right thing, and there's kind of not another choice, right? So it's not so hard to figure out what the right thing to do is, and to do it, you have to expect the barbs, and they can be painful, no question about it.
Yeah, just to build on that, to give my example, when I was asked to be the independent counsel to investigate Whitewater by Janet Reno, I started putting my staff together, which included people from the U.S. Attorney's Office, people from Davis Polk, people from around the country, and I told them all when I was interviewing them, I said, look, whatever we do, we're going to get criticized. Either we're going to get criticized by one side because we're too aggressive and unfair, or we're going to get criticized by the other side because we're not aggressive enough. So you just don't have to worry about that. You just do your job. You look straight ahead. You don't worry about what the press is saying. And I think that's the way we really ran that office, and we ran it very effectively for the period of time we were there, just following that philosophy.
Jim, you have a comment on that?
Well, sure. Very short. As to the thick skin, I did mention I have 55 cousins. But when you grow up in the lower sort of quintile of that, you end up seeing a lot of perspectives, hearing sometimes criticism, but also you learn to understand, and we were a pretty wide range of personalities, abilities, outcomes in life. You get you're practiced in the ability to understand different perspectives, which, given some of the roles that I've had, was very, very helpful. There are few people that I meet, and it doesn't matter what their ethnic background is, that don't end up slotting into some personality that I grew up with and care deeply about. And so I care about you and convey that, which actually helps a lot, because in some respect you remind me of somebody in my family.
All three of you have in varying ways played a kind of unique legal role in various times, in which, in a wide variety of different contexts, you've been identified as the head of an investigation or a commission or an inquiry who is supposed to undertake an objective, independent, credible investigation, sometimes government-supported, sometimes independent of the government, sometimes even private, but with the notion that at the end of the day, you will report something and it'll be your signature at the end of the report that combines with the content of the report to make it the credible last word on the subject. And of course, that's an invitation for much of the kinds of criticism you've identified. But all three of you have done it. Maybe I'll start with Jim. For example, Jim, you've done this in one way as a co-chair of a task force to investigate the burnings of black churches during the Clinton administration, along with Deval Patrick. And then again, when you were asked to tackle the, incendiary issues of racial profiling by New Jersey State troopers, and then to serve as a monitor of Westchester's, at that point, non-compliance with mandates to build affordable housing. Can you talk a little bit about that role and what kind of lawyering that involved, and how you saw that as fitting into some of the other things you've wanted to do with your career?
Well, at each role, I apply lessons that I learned from others, whether it's watching Bob or from Mary Jo. Master the facts. In all of these discussions, when you have to bring different groups of people together, and sometimes folks that are really at knife's point, if you are the master of the facts in the room, that is a very important step forward. Two, in all of these things, it was important to me to understand that I could be absolutely right from a policy perspective, from a legal perspective, but if I hadn't worked to build a consensus, then I would just have a report that would sit on someone's desk. And I wasn't interested in that, particularly given that, say, with racial profiling in particular on the Turnpike, we're actually talking about consequences that were life and death for some people. And so it wasn't just a question of, okay, we can finish the report and walk away and we're good, but it's if we don't get this right, and if we don't get it right in a way that the public has confidence in, then the changes that we want to see won't take place, and some of the problems that we were trying to address, which the state admitted, and the state troopers admitted they had a problem with profiling. It started with 4 young men on their way to college interviews being shot by state troopers in a traffic stop. And so the stakes were huge, and I approached that task with a sense of that gravity, mindful of the fact that I had to listen to the state troopers. If it meant absorbing the vehement complaint, both in the public setting and then literally nose to nose from a sergeant in the state troopers union, who was the leader of the union, I had to do that because I had a mission that I was going to execute. And by listening to him, I was able to get to a point where he was saying, the findings, the recommendations are fair. And if you could get a sergeant in the New Jersey State Troopers to accept institutional change because they know that you've done the work to understand it, you've done the work to listen to it, then everything else becomes relatively worth the battle.
But then you also had to use the hammer underneath that velvet glove with regard to Westchester, for example.
Oh, absolutely. And that was there were two pieces to it. There was knowing that Judge Coate had my back was very important. In a lot of these circumstances, it's not going to be a question of, well, if we can just all get together and sing Kumbaya and be understanding, things will change. You need to have the force of the law or political force to bring about certain changes. And I was not uncomfortable with either going to the judge when necessary or working the press as well to make sure that the environment in which my findings and recommendations was landing was one that were basically, if I were planting seeds, that it was fertile ground. And to end up in a circumstance where the New York Times was saying, because of the caliber of the research we had done and the sort of the expertise that we had put together, this was a challenge where we wanted to not only build affordable housing, but we wanted it to be housing that worked for the community and with the community. And so we needed, and that actually African Americans and Hispanics, who were considered the least likely to apply, would actually want to go there. And so we had to work with the press to help create an environment that was a countermeasure or countervailing force to what was coming out of the Westchester County Executive, which was pretty vile.
So, Mary Jo, you've also done some of this same kind of work, sometimes in formal public areas like the New York City Police Department, other times in quasi-public areas like the Bishop of Albany, or just recently reported that the NFL has called on you again to address something that the public has a great interest in. Do you have any comment on that role?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's some of my, I must say, most satisfying work. I mean, you're essentially, trying to find out what happened. I mean, so obviously your investigative skills, are called upon, and people care very deeply, typically, at both sides of it. It's kind of a no-win situation. I mean, you're going to call it like you see it, but you're going to pay a price each time, from maybe both sides. I think certainly in recent years, each time that you are in the private sector retained to do one of these independent investigations, you're immediately attacked before you even start, because somebody's paying you to do that. Not always, sometimes you do it pro bono, obviously, from the private sector as well. And so therefore you can't be independent. So you've got to try to overcome that perception, both by mastering the facts, as Jim is saying, and just by understanding that when you deliver your findings, they're going to be received, negatively by everybody, probably, if you've done your job right, and you want to be able to explain, how you got there, to sort of, to be conveying a credible message. The other thing I would just add is I think in the public sector ones as well as the private sector ones, a great missed opportunity in many of them are at the recommendation stage. Now, what Jim has done is, really affected real change and reform in the ones that he's done. Sometimes it's not, quite that, there isn't quite that breadth of scope as to what you're doing, but at the end of the day, you've learned an awful lot about whatever this is that's got the public lit up on both sides. And if you don't spend a lot of time on trying to improve that system going forward, or improve, deal with the problem, you've really missed a great opportunity. And I think many lawyers, you find the facts, here it is, and here's kind of the check the box of things you ought to do better going forward. I think that's a mistake. So, John, one of the things I try to do is spend a lot of time on, what should be done differently going forward.
Thanks, Mary Jo. Now, Bob, the context that you've had this kind of work include New York State Troopers and, of course, Whitewater itself.
Yeah, well, with Whitewater, it was a situation where when President Clinton finally came out and said he wanted an independent counsel appointed, then I knew right away that because the Deputy Attorney General at that time was a man named Philip Hyman, who I'd worked with when I was U.S. Attorney, and the head of the criminal division in Washington was Joanne Harris, a wonderful woman, good friend of Mary Jo's, who'd been an assistant in the Southern District. I knew that my name would probably be at least considered. And so I was thinking about it for a couple of days. What will I do if I get the call? And I decided pretty quickly that if I got the call, I was certainly going to accept. And Joanne called and she said, Bob, is there any way you can do this? And I said, how could I possibly say no? So I went down and I met Janet Reno, and she just asked me two questions. She said, are you satisfied that you have all the authority that you need with your scope of your order that gives you jurisdiction? And secondly, she said, I don't expect to see you, talk to you again until this is over. Well, so there I was, all of a sudden I was the independent counsel, which meant for all practical purposes, I was the Attorney General of the United States for the area that I was looking into, which was whether President Clinton and Mrs. Clinton had been involved in improper conduct with their Whitewater investments. But I had no staff, I had no office, I had nothing. So the first thing I had to do was put a team together. And that was probably the most important part of this whole assignment, putting that team together. And the first thing I did, there were 3 former Davis Polk associates that I'd worked very closely with, who were all working for Mary Jo.
Yes, I recall that.
At the time.
Very well.
Two of
You
them
raided?
Two of them were deputy chiefs of the criminal division. I called up Mary Jo and I said, Mary Jo, can I have these people? Would you mind if I took them? And she was great. She said, by all means. So I started out with them, 3 people from that I knew, and it was so important to me to have the right kind of people on this. And then I got somebody from the former head of the Homicide Bureau in the DA's office to investigate the Vince Foster suicide issue. And so I had a team of people starting out that I knew really well and had total confidence in both their ability, their integrity, their ability to work as a team. But I wanted it to be a national team. I didn't want it just to be people from New York. And in the course of the first 2 days, I had probably 300 resumes that come in from all around the country. And I started looking at them, and I said, there's some people here on paper that look tremendous, but I really don't know anything about them. I don't know how they will react under pressure. I don't know how they will work collegially as a team. So I put all the resumes aside, and I made 2 calls, first of all. First, I called Griffin Bell, who'd been the Attorney General when I was the U.S. Attorney in the Southern District, then a partner at King and Spalding. And I said, Griffin, you must have some 45-year-old younger partner that if you had my job, you would bring him or her on as your chief of staff. Could I have that person for 3 years? And he said, I'll get back to you. And sure enough, the next day he called and he recommended somebody who came down, and we hit it off. And this person went on to become then the U.S. Attorney in Georgia later, and then a federal judge. And the other person I called because I had one woman on the team, Julie O'Sullivan, who had been at Davis Polk in the Southern District. I wanted another woman at that point. So I called Bob Mueller, who had just left the criminal division in Washington and gone to Hale and Dorr. And I said, Bob, you must have a 4th or 5th year woman associate at Hale and Dorr that would be a good fit for my team. And he said, yes, I got just the person. Her name is Gabriel Wolahojian. She's a tremendous lawyer. She also plays first violin in the Boston Civic Symphony Orchestra. So she came down. And anyway, through that, talking to people I knew, I put together a team that had all of the intangibles that were so important, people that would be team players, that people could work together collegially. They wouldn't worry about whether somebody was getting a more important part of the investigation than they were. And so because of that, we were able to work very effectively and very cohesively. And secondly, when I announced the team and with the credentials that the team had, that gave our investigation an immediate credibility because I got calls from all over from people who are actually saying in the press, if this looks like a really serious investigation, if there are people of this caliber that are on the team. So that was, I think, the crucial thing in our investigation. And as I said, I told them all from the beginning, we just have to do our job, and we got criticized a lot from both sides. But in the end, I think we did a tremendous job.
Now, Jim, you've had an extraordinary collection of jobs. One category of jobs that you've had is ones that involve overseeing humongous operations. At Treasury, 29,000 employees. As the chief legal officer for the city of New York, the entire New York City Law Department, and now you work at Trinity. How does that fit into the other work that you've liked to do, and how do you sort of compare that work to the work that you've done as the single monitor, building and bridging the compromise in the complex disputes that require your personal engagement?
To me, it's all of one piece. There are many jobs, but I talked a little bit about my family background. There is one mission, which is impact, and these were all opportunities to have some sort of an impact, and the impact is often personal. So in Westchester County, where I was dealing with affordable housing, there were two things that in my life that had touched that. One was when I was 12, my dad had a business turnaround, terrible, collapse actually, and we almost lost our home. So I knew what it was like to actually feel housing insecure. And he had been a real estate agent, and as an African-American real estate agent in the 60s, there were a limited number of places that he could sell. And so the opportunity, and I'm really grateful, in two of the jobs that you've talked about, the special assignments, Debevoise supported me in both of those, pro bono at non-trivial sums, and with great talent. But in all of them, they've been opportunities to have a real impact. And the lessons from the times when I have small teams apply to larger institutions, because in a small team, you do have to, particularly when you're not well funded, you have to motivate your team and engage with them and create a sense of a campaign. When you're leading a large institution, it is impossible to know what everyone on your team is doing. And so over time, the skills of communicating with small groups translate into making a large group feel like you're communicating to a small group. And so even in the Zoom era, when we were, and very much during the pandemic, no one was showing up at the law department. I had a grand operation in a great big building by myself. And so what I learned how to do was almost become a telecaster, where I would talk directly to the camera as if it were a friend and establish a connection with lawyers not only in the law department, but I had dotted line authority over pretty much every legal shop in the city government, and not just the mayoral legal shops, but also the parts of the other independent agencies. But that ability to communicate was a big part of trying to run it. And the same thing happened with the Treasury Department, trying to get those very disparate bureaus to understand that they were part of one Treasury Department, which some accepted and others resisted. But then articulating a message that could translate down through the field, so that people could say, oh yeah, this is what he has said about us in Congress. This is who we are. And once you give people a sense of who they are and what their practices should be, then that translates into an impact on people that you will never actually see personally. But they will have a sense of, oh, this is our particular story. He is the one leading the story. These are the things that we're doing as part of the story. And you can affect change that way too.
So just for fun, let me ask each of you, what's the thing you've done in your legal career that you're most proud of, and why? Let me give Mary Jo the least time to prepare.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for that. I mean, That's really hard. I mean, it's, maybe I'll answer a similar question. I'll do one of those congressional dodges, right, and answer my own question.
Hey, answer the question you wanted to.
That's something
That
Jim,
question.
thank you for that question. I'm answering my own. I do get asked, and so therefore I've thought about it, as U.S. Attorney, and this is in this Southern District and Eastern District for that matter, which is almost 12 years, which is really a very long time, kind of what case am I proudest of? I mean, pride may not be the right word, but maybe it is. I mean, I did an awful lot of work on terrorism cases in the Southern District that were obviously very important ones, the bombing of the Trade Center, our embassies in East Africa. That was a huge part of what we did, and I spent a lot of personal time on that. I don't know if I'm proud of that, but it's certainly something I was very, very focused on. But I think the case that I actually am proudest of when I was U.S. Attorney was the civil rights case that we actually brought in connection with the death of Anthony Baez. I forget which year that occurred, maybe 1996. Essentially, we prosecuted a fairly high-placed police officer for the death of Anthony Baez after the police officer had been acquitted of, I think, second-degree homicide in the state courts. Essentially, again, I know I'm saying essentially over and over, but Christmas Eve in the Bronx, Anthony Baez was throwing a football around with his brothers in the streets, around midnight, and this officer was there in his patrol car, and the ball hit the hood of the car, which enraged this officer, who, by the way, had a number of complaints for use of excessive force. He essentially eventually arrested Anthony Baez, who may or may not have resisted, but whether he did or not justified. The officer put him in a chokehold. He had asthma, and he died. Horrible, tragic, obviously. In the U.S. Attorney's Office, you often are called upon, by the way, when something like that happens and there's been a state acquittal, do you bring a second prosecution or not? There's a little bit of a presumption you don't. It's a double jeopardy, et cetera. You may not do that, but, this is a case, very difficult case, which we decided to go forward on and convicted the officer. I think he served 6.5 years in jail. Remember, it's a civil rights charge, not a homicide, charge. And our executive assistant, U.S. attorney at the time, Fred Varela, came into my office, and I've told this before, but I mean, I never forgot it. I mean, he came in, tears streaming down his face to thank me for bringing this case. And I'm like, of course we're bringing this case. We're doing justice here. We're going to try to by bringing this case and hopefully obtaining a conviction. But he was so moved by the fact that the office would bring this very difficult case, which obviously conveyed the message to me of, all of the difficulties in the fairness of our system. You have law enforcement on one side and you have the community on the other side. And law enforcement and our institutions had failed the community over and over again. So that's the case I think I'm proudest of that we brought, and it was very, very difficult. But it worked out in a way that at least some measure of justice was brought for that death.
Thanks, Mary Jo. Bob?
Yeah, well, I would also talk about my time in the U.S. Attorney's Office, which I have told people for my entire career that those were the best 4 years of my career, the years in U.S. Attorney's Office. But probably the most important case was the case that I tried myself. It involved a narcotics dealer named Nicky Barnes, and he was notorious in the late 70s because he was running the largest drug ring probably in the country. And he had been indicted 4 times in the state, twice in the Bronx, twice in Harlem, and twice in Manhattan. Been acquitted 4 times, so he had the reputation of Mr. Untouchable. We indicted him in the spring of '77, and we had three very good assistant U.S. attorneys who were going to try the case. But what happened in June, I went out one Sunday to get the New York Times, and I came back, and on the cover of the magazine section, there was a picture of Nicky Barnes in a very arrogant pose, posing on the courthouse. And there was a long article about how he had led this life in Harlem where he was flaunting law enforcement, flashy cars, fancy suits, and he would lead law enforcement on wild goose chases around the city. And then one of the article ended with a scenario where in the middle of one of those state trials, they'd gone into he went into the washroom and there was a city detective there. They were both washing their hands. The detective had a paper towel, and Nicky reached into his pocket and pulled out a roll of $100 bills, dried his hands with them, threw them at the detective, and walked out. And in the process, he had become a role model for young kids. This was one of the most insidious things about it. Young African-American kids in the Bronx and Harlem were saying, you know, the white guys go to Wall Street, we can be drug dealers and make much more money and get away with it just like Nicky has. So the last line in the article was, Nicky's been acquitted 4 times in the state. The feds are taking their shot, but the betting in Harlem is Nicky's going to win again. So the next morning, it was a Monday morning at about 9 o'clock, the phone rings, and it's the Attorney General, Griffin Bell. And he said, Bob, I've just come from a cabinet meeting. President Carter read this article. And he said to the cabinet, this is the most important case we have anywhere in the country, because if we can't put somebody like this away, there's something wrong with our criminal justice system. And then he said to me, and the president had asked him, he said, do we have a good case? Bell had no idea. Told the president, don't worry, Mr. President, we're fine. And he said to me, we do have a good case, don't we, Bob? And I said, well, it's got its problems, but, you know, I think we'll be okay. And then there was a pause, and he said, Bob, this case is really important to the president. I said, I get it. So I came in and I tried the case with 2 of the assistants, and fortunately we convicted him, and he got life without parole. But the significance of the case was we really did break up one of the most insidious drug rings in the history of drug dealing. And secondly, more important, I think we sent a message to the kids in Harlem that, you know, being a drug dealer is not a viable career path. So that's the most important case. But I would just say one other thing that reflecting back on my career, and I'm sure John will get to this in a minute, but one of the things that's been most important to me in my career is working with young lawyers, mentoring them, helping them grow as lawyers. And one of the most gratifying things for me is just looking back in my career at all of those 28-year-olds at Davis, Polk, and in the U.S. Attorney's Office that have gone on to be United States senators, 3 United States attorneys, including Mary Jo, high-ranking Justice Department people, federal judges, state judges, and just to feel that I had some role in their advancement to those positions has been extremely gratifying for me.
Thanks, Bob. Jim?
So 3 quick points. One, in terms of jobs, any job in which I felt I was really learning and growing, that's my favorite job at the time. 2, in terms of cases, when I was the Assistant Secretary for Enforcement at the Treasury Department, co-leading with Deval the Church Arson Task Force, we took the solve rate and conviction rate of arsons from 15% to 32%. And when you've had an opportunity to meet with people who have lost their churches and can say to you things like, you know, our church building was actually, the pews were crafted by formerly enslaved people, and we lost those. And you and Deval are giving us hope. That's a huge thing. But the job that moved me most was probably the hardest, helping to, from the legal chair, lead the city at a time of pandemic and racial reckoning was tremendously challenging, had a level of uncertainty to it that no other time, I think, has had for any of us, particularly collectively. And at the end of the day, it was one where I felt changed in ways that I would never have anticipated, and I felt connected to my team in ways that none of us ever would have anticipated because of what we went through together and the spirit that we had in going through it together, and the hard questions, most of which we got right, some of which we didn't. that we had to grapple with together, because the only way forward was together. And it was the one job where I would say it's tremendously hard, but I wouldn't have wanted to be anywhere else.
So Jim, let me follow up on Bob's prediction, but start with you and just ask the three of you also. Can you identify some things that you think were important that teachers taught you, and also some things that you thought it was important for you to try to teach to people who were, or at least model to people who were working with you over the years?
Well, I mean, I have in this room a larger number of teachers than is actually fair to any one person to have. But just speaking to the folks that are on the stage, I didn't work with Bob Fiske, but I was an assistant U.S. attorney when the Attorney General asked him to lead the Whitewater investigation. And what struck me, and I actually went back this afternoon to his first press conference, was that he defined independence. The White House counsel had sent a letter over to the Attorney General saying, this is what the investigation should be. And at the press conference, Bob described what the investigation was going to be. And one of the questions was, well, you know, White House counsel has sent over this letter saying this is what you're going to look at. His response, I haven't looked at it. But to me, that was the touchstone of what you should be as a lawyer. I've already talked about what I've learned from Mary Jo White, just in the narrow sense of mastery of the facts. But there were so many other things. So those are lessons I've learned. What I've tried to convey are a handful of things. Be curious. Be curious. It's not only a great tool for an investigator, but it's also a great tool for a negotiator, or a great tool for someone who's trying to actually reach good, solid solutions. Be curious. Be willing to turn even your position around to another perspective to understand how you might arrive at common ground. Two is apply different modes of thought to your inquiry. So by that I mean this. In law school, from a tort perspective, we're often taught, okay, let's figure out who's liable, who had the last clear chance. That's one way to look at a problem. An engineer would ask you, well, what's the root cause? And there are a series of questions that you would interrogate as an engineer, probably about 5 they talk about, to get to the root cause of a particular phenomenon. If you want to move into a phase where you're coming up with a solution, then it's not just root cause, but even trying to understand how a system works, because very often legal solutions have unintended consequences. And I talk to my mentees about, say, prohibition. Look at what that solved, all right? And finally, thinking like a designer, which involves empathy, which involves experimentation. All of those tools you should bring to the task. Understand the facts, different modes of thinking, but at the end of the day, an important thing is just character. Whatever it takes for you to strengthen yourself, to be prepared to take the blows, to build your character, do those things. Because a lot of things are going to fail you over a long career. But if you have that sort of a foundation, you'll figure out a way to get to the right answer.
Thanks, Jim. Mary Jo?
Well, those are big questions. I mean, I guess I would start with Bob Fiske has taught. It all goes back to Bob, if you can't tell, right? I mean, for everybody. I mean, he's been such a tremendous role model, public sector, public servant, and in the private sector. That just, if you want to know, what would Bob say? What would Bob do? I mean, that's what, has sort of guided so many of us, really, in everything we've done. Andy Maloney, who was the U.S. Attorney in the Eastern District, whom I worked for, he also brought me back into the government, for which I'm very grateful, too. And, I got to sort of sit, at his left arm or right arm, whichever it was, for a couple of years while he was there and I was first assistant. And he taught me a couple of very important things about being a prosecutor, I think. One was, you never get in trouble by being too tough as a prosecutor, but you've got to do the right, fair thing, even if you get criticized royally for it. The other thing he said was, And don't believe in your clippings, positive or negatively. If you ever do, you're lost because you're going to lose that, that moral compass. In terms of what I teach, I don't think of myself, as a teacher, but obviously as, do the right thing and do it in the right way. Work hard, keep that bar of excellence as high as you possibly can. If some slice of life, legal or otherwise, grabs you, do not make the mistake of not following that pull. I mean, you've got 50 years to be a lawyer, and you should, you should have all of those opportunities. As a leader, I think you want to take interest in the people who work with you, both professionally in their work and personally. I always would say to people, do what I say, not what I do, sometimes, because you'd sort of be talking about, for example, in the U.S. Attorney's Office, had a lot of young women assistant U.S. attorneys who came in and were really quite conflicted about whether to take time off or after their second child was born. And I said, look, if you've got that conflict, do it. Go out. You can't get this time back with your children. And, I've told this story before, but when my husband and I were both, workaholic lawyers, if I'm honest, right? But when our son was born, we tried never to be out of town on the same night, and we succeeded pretty well. Our son's 9 months old. My husband's going somewhere. I'm about to interview at Harvard. Obviously not the year I interviewed Jim, because I went. But at the last minute, I pulled out of that interview. And that night, our son was 9 months old, and he walked, right? We would have both missed that opportunity. So I always sort of tell that story when somebody is, really conflicted, about that. So, I think it's really, again, I'm not a preacher on things. I mean, I do believe in, telling people to be practical. The people at Debevoise get tired of me saying, go from A to B to C. Is this person able to go from A to B to C? Or how can you actually make a difference? And there's so many ways you can make a difference, both by kind of the example you set, obviously, but also by the work you do. And, for example, very early in my career, 1970s, a young associate at Debevoise, I actually was on a committee here at the Bar Association. There was an issue about the pass rate on the New York bar by minority lawyers. And so what do we do about that was this sort of committee's, assignment. And, in my usual way, I said, well, let's hire Jerry Lynch to tutor minority lawyers to pass the bar exam. And guess what? It worked. And it was a very modest thing, to do. But be practical. Be practical.
Well, I had three really important mentors. The first, I mentioned him already, was Judge Lombard. And he had a great saying. He told all his assistants, never assume a goddamn thing. And I can't tell you how many times in my career I've thought about that and saved myself from a huge mistake. The other thing he did was he really was one that infused me with a sense of public service. And it was very important to Judge Lombard that his assistants, when they finished, came back into various positions in public service. And he sort of set that example for me. And when I became U.S. Attorney, I really tried to run the office as much as I could the way he had run it during that summer that I had observed. And then at Davis Polk, I had two wonderful mentors. One was Hazard Gillespie, great trial lawyer and a great person. And I remember he used to tell us, when you're writing a brief, emphasize the statement of facts. Because if you write the statement of facts in such a way that the court thinks or you should win, they'll find some legal principle to make that happen. And he said when an oral argument, he went back to his mentor, John W. Davis, who had written a famous piece for the Bar Association. 10 points on oral advocacy. The most important was always go for the jugular. And then equally important, he taught me how you can be a very aggressive, hard-hitting advocate and at the same time be civil and courteous to your adversary. And then the other was Judge Walsh, and he was sort of an out-of-the-box thinker before anybody had coined that phrase. And he always used to tell us, don't come to me with some routine, by-the-book approach until you've thought it through and see whether there's some more effective, imaginative way to do it. And he said, and this is important, and this is sort of like not reading your press clippings, he said, don't get so carried away with your own side of the case that you lose your objectivity. Step back, look at the way a court or a jury would see both sides, and then he finally said, you know, always give it your very, very best. So those were three mentors that I had. And then when I was working with younger lawyers, whether it was the U.S. Attorney's Office or particularly at Davis Polk, I loved working with a team. Every case was great because you had a team. And it was very important to me, as I described putting together the Whitewater team, who those people were, how they worked together. And I always made sure that I knew what every single person on the case was doing, every associate, and I would always find some way to interact with that person to make sure they understood that I knew what they were doing was important and that I cared about them. And I think what mentoring really means and it's so important for lawyers, senior lawyers, to be good mentors to younger lawyers. First of all, you tell them what you learned from your mentors. Secondly, you take them into court with you or whatever you're doing, you're negotiating with somebody, and then at the end, after it's over, you talk to them about, well, this is why I did this or this is why I didn't do this, so they can learn by watching. And then most important to me is you give the associate the maximum amount of responsibility, sometimes more than they think they're able to handle. You push them out there to the very limit, but you're always right there behind them to help them. And after it's over, you're there watching them take a deposition or whatever, and then you give them on the spot compliments for what they did well, suggestions of what they maybe could do better the next time. But again, always trying to also teach them the important values about fairness to people, treat everyone with respect that you're dealing with, and I think those are the things that are most important to me in terms of treating younger lawyers.
Thanks, Bob. By the way, if anyone is interested in the longer version of the Who Are You, Where Did You Come From, How Did You Get Here, I commend Bob's memoir, aptly titled Prosecutor, Defender, Counselor. It's been a pleasure to read in the last week for me, and I think many of you would find a really fascinating and great read. So let me ask each of you three seasoned veterans to solve a present-day conundrum. We all know that the last few years have witnessed a kind of a jolt to the way everyone practices law. The combination of adjustments to the pandemic and the advent of Zoom and the increase of capacity for remote working. And we all know that it's not going to be the same going forward. Assume we all start with the belief that the collegial and interpersonal components of law are a big part of a happy and fulfilling career, but also recognize that technology now enables us to communicate more effectively while not in office and to move more flexibly between office and home, and permitting participation in family activities that were not readily achievable in earlier periods. And when we look at all this together, how do we see the collegial law office practice looking in the future?
Shows you how clear that one is, right?
I'll be glad to take a shot at that. I mean, I think you could probably understand from what I just said a minute ago how important I think interpersonal relationships are. You can't, I don't think, build a team and the collegiality that goes with a team by participating in Zoom calls. I mean, you have to be there together. There's nothing like sitting around a room from 7 to 10 at night in a war room, eating pizza, planning the strategy for the next day. You make friendships, that are lasting friendships through that, and you're also far more effective in the way you function. And I understand the convenience of working from home, and I'm not suggesting everybody has to be in the office 5 days a week, but I certainly think that if it trends too far towards the Zoom call, younger lawyers are going to lose out on an awful lot of important relationships that will help build them as lawyers.
Look, I think this is a huge, I agree with everything Bob said, but I think it's a huge challenge. I mean, I think lawyers have learned how much we can do without ever setting foot outside our kitchen, right? I mean, and you talk about work-life balance. I mean, it's easier when you are home all the time, and I think that's a good thing, not a bad thing, I mean, to a point. So I don't think we're ever going to quite get back to the 5-day-a-week kind of collegial, environment that we were in before.
5 days a week, which firm were you at?
Seven. Okay. I was trying to pretend I only work 5 days a week, but Jim knows me, so you can Zoom on Saturday and Sunday, though. You can do that. But look, I think you got to make the opportunities now. I mean, first of all, the partners have to set the example in the firms, because partners have gotten to like this life also. It's not coming in 3 days a week even necessarily, and you've got to force it a bit right now as we're sort of transitioning back to living with the virus, and we're going to have to live with the virus. I mean, it's a so I think you've got to just, watch it very closely right now to make sure it's happening, because the younger lawyers are the ones who really worry about what they've missed already, by not being around older lawyers and around, courtrooms and so forth. So it's going to be something really to focus on.
I think that we should first talk to younger lawyers about what folks, if you come into the law in the last 2 years, you actually don't know what you may have missed. And it's not just a question of the hours, but talking about the caliber of relationships. So, for example, Sheila had mentioned Conrad Harper, one of the former presidents of the bar, who has mentored me in various ways since 1996, so more than a minute. And because of the nature of the pandemic, we haven't been physically present with each other in 2 years and change. And when I think about when I was coming back from going down to Washington first, and then coming back and having quarterly lunches with Conrad, and other times to sit down, and not having had that, there's no question I would have been a very different kind of a partner and participant in Debevoise had I just been doing my job remotely and not having the benefit of all the things that happened in that relationship and continue to happen, including character formation. So part of it is actually explaining and really trying to emphasize what is so valuable about it, as we both push and pull, and then figuring out different ways to it's sort of artificial, but ways to use Zoom to establish a different kind of interaction and even intimacy. We have learned how to do that with our families, and there are ways to do that between older lawyers and younger lawyers if we change the lens just a little bit on what should be an important part of that relationship. And then really emphasizing you're missing a lot when you're not in together. And actually you end up sometimes working harder and less efficiently because you can't walk down the hall and just say, I just had this quick question.
So some of you in the audience are already acquainted with one, two, or all three of our distinguished panelists tonight. Does any of you have a question that you want to just pose to all three of them while we have these three extraordinary leaders all in one place?
Do not answer that, on the advice of counsel.
Trying to noodle through how it is that I got emails from Mary Jo when I was trying to be responsive to her emails, but they were at 8, 10, 12, 2, 4, 6, and 8
That's
in the morning.
Work-life balance we were talking about earlier. Yeah, but when you sleep 4 hours a night, you sleep 4 different hours a night, it really keeps people on their toes because they never know when you're going to be out there, right? Besides, I'll forget what I was thinking if I don't put it in the email, right, when I think about it. You had a question, I think, out here with this gentleman, yeah.
How has the legal profession changed, better or for worse?
Well, I'll say something that I worry about, and this will be a generational comment. You know, I come from the baby boomer group, right, which is getting older and older as we go through this, and I worry about the legal profession and whether we're keeping the bar of excellence high enough in every matter. It's not easy. I mean, I think the profession is not easy. I think it's an extraordinarily rewarding profession if it's the right one for, each of us. But it's a lot of hard work, really hard work. And I worry about the quality of the work product if that diminishes. This is sort of true confessions by the workaholic up here probably, but I do worry about that. I also worry about, kind of what I think is gotten in the water where, there's certain kinds of clients, if you represent them, that you're, criticized or eliminated or disqualified from doing other things. A few years back, an example, many of us represented, many of the law firms and others represented the detainees in Guantanamo. And there was, a movement basically to say, such people who represented terrorists cannot be appointed to a presidential appointee in a public service job. Bar Association stood up against that, as did many of the rest of us. Flip side of that coin, lawyers who worked in the Trump administration go into the private sector and a client says, you've got to fire that person. They worked not for anything they did, but because they, represented the Trump administration. And then there are other examples of that, too. And I think we need to preserve what's very important about the legal profession. At least one part of that is providing representation to clients, even if they're unpopular clients to some people. So I worry about that.
Bob?
I go way back, so I can go. When I started in 1955, I was in a firm of 90 white males, and it was probably 10 years before we had a first woman associate, and probably another 5 years before we had a minority associate. Obviously, one of the great changes in the profession has been improving that situation, both in terms of women and also minorities. Obviously, it's not perfect, it can still get better, but the profession has made enormous strides from where it was when I first started. The other thing that has changed a lot from when I first started, there were only 3 or 4 major law firms. Everyone had their clients, and basically that was it. The client, Davis Polk, represented J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan would go to Davis Polk for every single thing that Davis Polk was capable of doing. And it was sort of an easy way to practice law because you had regular clients. Obviously, that's changed much for the better from the point of view of clients, where now every single matter is sort of up for grabs, and there's healthy competition between firms, which is very much for the benefit of the clients and overall for the legal profession. My biggest concern, I think, is there was, and I put this in the foreword of my book, but Judge Rifkin, a wonderful judge and a wonderful leader of Paul Weiss, had a mantra where he said, the practice of law is a power and trust, not for the benefit of the individual lawyer, but for the benefit of the members of the community. And I think the pressures in the firms now for the bottom line, you talk about leverage, the more associates you can have on a matter in relation to the partners, that's better for the bottom line. That's much harder for the partners to have the kind of relationship, the mentoring relationships with the younger associates. So that's one of my biggest concerns, that we're getting away from what the practice of law really should be in terms of the benefit to the community, in terms of putting profits ahead of that.
So I would pick up on that strand in the following sense. Big bias. I do the smaller. I've handled smaller cases and 3- and 4-person teams trying to affect change. But I I work in one 300-plus-year-old institution, having left another 300-plus-year-old institution. I'm a bit of an institutionalist. And I see law firms as being less institutional players in civil society than we used to be. And I think we've lost a lot as a result of that. I think, and particularly at a time when the only thing civil in society is when we attach their word to it because we're decidedly uncivil. We do need institutions and we do need lawyers to be the proving grounds of how we can manage disputes together, how we can come up with good solutions together, and both do well and do good. And I feel that we've lost a lot of that. And I think it's really to the societal detriment.
You mean today?
Today?
Yeah, basically, yeah.
Well, so I was just institutions generally, and I would just a significant caveat. My wife actually has the case in the Supreme Court that is the subject of the leak, and she and I have a rule that we don't make public comment on each other's stuff. so I won't do that. But generally, you see in a lot of the government institutions, and it's not just the Supreme Court, but in both houses of Congress. And elsewhere, an inability for us to get important things done at a time when we are facing in certain areas existential threats to the fabric of our democracy and to our climate. It is, it's been a long time since I've testified before Congress, but I testified when I was Assistant Secretary and Undersecretary probably 18 times. And I thought that there were times when it was just bananas, to use a technical term. Then I've represented clients before Congress, and I've just seen it become progressively worse. And I'm fortunate to know fairly well Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson. And what was visited upon her was an absolute abomination. And so I think we need to plant seeds in other places to get to a better place because our major institutions are not going to heal themselves.
One of the problems is we've talked a lot about the partisanship, and driving people away from public service. But for years now, the people that actually are, the selection criteria are also partisan. So SEC agency, for example, independent agency, 5-person commission, constructed so that only 3 people can be in the same party as the president. But in recent years, except for the chairman, the other 4 commissioners have been, the choice of them has been delegated to the minority and majority leader of the Senate. Well, guess what that leads to? You don't even have to ask, what they think about an issue because they're going to go with the Republicans or the Democrats, depending on, who appointed them. That's obviously crept into judicial appointments, too. And it's not, the merits of the candidate, their objectivity, or at least their, ability for objectivity. So we got to do something about who we're putting in these positions of incredible power.
What's the question? Oh, well, I think I think if you're talking about the partisanship in Washington, I think that's just gotten worse and worse. You go back 10 years and you had real giants in the Senate, like George Mitchell and William Cohen, Sam Nunn, Bill Bradley, Jacob Javits. They were great. Warren Rudman. They worked together. I mean, they would have differences of opinion, but they would work together. And then we'd get things done. And now it's gotten to the point where most of them left the Senate. Cohen left the Senate writing a book or paper saying he couldn't stay in the Senate because they couldn't get anything done. And this was 13 years ago. And I remember this. This is just a digression, but it's a kind of a good story. When Harold Tyler was the Deputy Attorney General, this is back in when I was a U.S. attorney. There was a man from upstate New York that he wanted to be a federal judge. And Eastland was chairing the Senate Judiciary Committee. He's a Democrat, was blocking it. And so nothing was getting done. And then one night, Eastland said to Tyler, well, why don't you come on over here tomorrow afternoon? So Tyler went over there at about 5 o'clock. They put a bottle of bourbon on the table, and each had a drink or two. And Eastland said, so you want this guy to be a federal judge? And Tyler said, yes. He said, well, I got this guy in Mississippi. What he really wants to be is a U.S. Marshal. And if you could see fit to pick this guy as a U.S. Marshal, I think I could approve your guy for the judgeship. And Tyler said, if I had a list for the Marshal, 1 to 10, this guy might be number 8, but he was on the list. And so Tyler said, it's a deal. So Eastland got his Marshal, Tyler got his judge. I don't think that kind of thing happens now. It's gotten so polarized, and people actually get credit within their own party for blocking things instead of getting things done. I mean, I'm not telling anybody anything they don't already know, but it's tragic.
So how do we change that dynamic?
Well, I had an interview with Cohen for the American College of Trial Lawyers a year ago, and I asked him that very question, and he said he starts at the top, and he gave the example, and of course he's a perfect example of it. He was a Republican senator from Maine, and then Clinton picked him to be his Secretary of Defense. So he's a Republican senator being the Secretary of Defense in a Democratic administration. And he said that sort of sets the example. You start at the top. He said the other thing, and this is a little bit of a digression, but he said back then, the senators lived in Washington. They would get together. They would socialize. They get to be friends. And when they're friends, they could work together. He said now everyone's living back in their home state. They're traveling around raising money, and they don't ever get together, and they don't have that kind of relationship. So he said if there was some way to bring that back together again, that would help.
I would suggest a both and, top and grassroots. At the top, often it doesn't trickle down because of our federal system, and so much of the mischief starts at the school board level and otherwise. So I've been part of a group called the Citizens Campaign. And what we have been working on, it's throughout New Jersey and in other parts of the country and in junior colleges, is developing a system of essentially no-blame problem solving, where the folks join what are called civic cities. They take essentially the Athenian oath to leave their community better than they found it. They learn the principles of government. And at the municipal level, and it's started small, and it has started to spread. There are probably 7 cities in New Jersey that have it, including Newark and Patterson and Trenton, all of which need it. But it's also in Miami, and it's in Texas and elsewhere. And folks are learning what it means to be a citizen of democracy, and they're getting good results. If it were just a civics course that people were teaching, no one would have time for it. But the fact that they are able to figure out ways to communally purchase green energy and to develop communal systems, and also their solutions are mostly budget neutral. When you have proof of concept like that, then people say, well, wait a second, there is a different way for us to be together. And the practice of democracy starts on the local level. And if we can start to get more of that right, which is hard in a much longer term project, and we have changes at the top as well, then I think we can get more traction.
Sure. We're going to make this the last question.
Question about, well, actually, all 3 of you, but two things that changed, both at large firms,
Well, I would say one answer I'd give to that is, and I think we've talked about this all throughout this whole program, is that people in private practice that go into government become much better lawyers when they go back to their firms. So it's perfectly fine to start at a firm and make some money to get started. But that doesn't mean you can't go into government at some point. And if you do go, and I remember when I became an assistant U.S. attorney, I was there for 4 years, and I took a huge pay cut. And I remember thinking that basically what I'm doing here is I'm paying for this experience. So I was there working every night, basically, because I wanted to get the maximum experience out of that 4 years. And then, of course, that was the foundation for going back to Davis Polk, becoming a partner, later becoming U.S. attorney in my whole career. So I think that you can start in private practice, but going into government will make you a better lawyer.
I mean, I think you're
That's one
hearing kind of the case for, another argument for the case of private sector and public service, doing both. And some of that is financial. I mean, when I was U.S. attorney and Bob sort of describing it, after the second child, I knew I was losing the assistant U.S. attorney because of the financial piece. But I think, for most people, there's nothing as rewarding as public service, but I also think the private sector is enormously rewarding apart from the money. And obviously the money allows you to, then also spend, significant stints of your career in the public sector, so.
To the younger person, I would say, lead a life that you consider valuable. And then I would ask questions. What is it that you gravitate to when you're reading the newspaper? What is it that you reach for when you're in a library? And what's the book on the shelf that you find fascinating? And do what sets you on fire. That's different from following your bliss. But it's like, what do you think gives your life purpose? Because we're all here a pretty short period of time. After a while, there's about, you can get another house and another house after that. But you have to live with yourself. And if you've gotten all that and you have not spent your time in a way that you consider valuable at the end of the day, then it doesn't amount to much. And for some of us, it means, and don't get me wrong, as a kid who saw a sheriff's notice on the family garage door and the house was being sold, there was no question that I was going to land at Debevoise Plimpton for some period of time. The question, I grew up looking at Thurgood Marshall, who was not a millionaire. And he was held up as a paragon of what you should be doing with your life. And my father was a Marine who always talked about you need to be of service. And so I would say serve others, definitely take care of your family, and serve in a way that you feel at the end of the day is worthwhile, which is kind of the sort of lesson that Conrad used to teach me all the time.
So I think we could all happily stay here listening to this. It can only be described as genuine wisdom from our terrific panelists tonight all night. But we've been going for a long time, and there's some refreshments out in the reception area now. So let us together thank the panelists for joining us.
That was fun. Yes. Great.